The evening had been unusually calm, one of those rare stretches in early autumn when the air hung cool and still. The cicadas buzzed lazily in the distance, and the neighborhood seemed to sink into a collective sigh of relief after a long day. I had just finished washing the dinner dishes and sat down with a book, enjoying the soft hum of quiet that wrapped itself around my house like a blanket. My fence, freshly painted white, stood proud along the edge of the yard, a project I had tackled over the summer despite endless muttering from the HOA president about its unapproved shade of ivory. To me, it was perfect, sturdy, neat, and right where it was supposed to be. But tranquility has a funny way of shattering at the most inconvenient moments, and it did so with the screech of tires and a gut-wrenching crash that sent me running outside. At first, I thought a tree had fallen, or perhaps two cars had collided on the curve leading into our street. But when I reached the front porch, the scene before me made my stomach drop. There, at an awkward angle and nose deep into my fence, was a glossy black sedan, its headlights glaring like stunned eyes. Wooden posts were splintered and bent around its crumpled bumper, boards littered across the lawn like fallen soldiers. Smoke hissed faintly from under the hood, curling into the cool evening air. My beautiful fence, the one I had labored over, the one I had proudly maintained in defiance of the HOA's nitpicking, was broken and twisted in a heap. And the driver, I realized with mounting disbelief, was none other than the son of the woman who had spent months making my life miserable, our infamous HOA president, Karen. Karen's son pushed open the car door with exaggerated nonchalance, as though he hadn't just plowed into private property in front of half the neighborhood. He stumbled slightly, brushing himself off, and ran a hand through his messy hair. Yeah, sorry about that, he said half-heartedly, avoiding my eyes. Then, without missing a beat, he shifted the blame. But, you really shouldn't have your fence sticking out this far. It's kind of your fault. His words were casual, but his tone carried that same entitled edge his mother was known for. Before I could even respond, he kicked at one of the fallen boards and added, "You'll probably need to pay for the damage to my car." Just saying. The audacity of it all left me speechless for a moment. I glanced from the mangled boards back to him, then back to the yard I knew by heart. My fence wasn't sticking out. It wasn't in the road. It was exactly where the surveyor had marked my property line years ago, planted firmly and legally. The only thing out of place was his car, embedded in my lawn like an unwelcome monument. My voice finally returned, sharp with indignation. "Excuse me? My fault? That fence has been standing there for years, and you drove into it. How in the world is that on me?" But he just shrugged, his confidence unnerving. "It's just common sense. Fences like that shouldn't be so close to the road. If it hadn't been there, I wouldn't have hit it. Think about it." His logic was so twisted it bordered on absurd comedy, and yet he spoke with the assuredness of someone who had been coddled all his life. I could almost hear his mother's voice in his words, blaming others, deflecting responsibility, rewriting rules to suit her own version of reality. My pulse quickened with anger. This wasn't just a careless accident, it was an extension of the same arrogance I had battled at HOA meetings month after month. By then, neighbors began to drift outside, drawn by the sound of the crash. Lights flicked on across the street, doors opened, and curious faces appeared at the ends of driveways. A few people gasped when they saw the wreck, whispering to one another as they edged closer. Some pulled out their phones, recording quietly from a distance. This wasn't just a car accident, it was drama, and in a community as tightly wound as ours, drama spread faster than wildfire. Before long, the wail of a siren pierced the night, growing louder as a police cruiser turned onto our street. The flashing blue and red lights cast everything in a surreal glow, illuminating the wrecked fence and the sheepish young man standing beside it. Two officers stepped out of the car, their faces professional but clearly curious. They surveyed the scene with quick, practiced glances before approaching. "What happened here?" one asked, pulling out a small notepad. Karen's son straightened up and immediately launched into a story, his voice loud enough for the entire street to hear. "Yeah, so, I was driving and this fence, like it's built way too close to the road, totally came out of nowhere. I had no way to avoid it. Honestly, the homeowner shouldn't have put it here in the first place. I think she's responsible. He gestured dramatically toward me, his words dripping with false conviction. I stared at him in disbelief, heat rising in my cheeks. Officer, that is absolutely not true, I said firmly, stepping forward. My fence is well within my property line. It's been approved by the city, and I have the paperwork to prove it. He lost control of his car and drove into it. Plain and simple. The officer scribbled notes, but gave me a small, reassuring nod, as if to say he understood the obvious truth. His partner circled the car, inspecting the damage, while neighbors whispered and chuckled at the audacity of the young man's claims. Still, he pressed on, refusing to admit fault. Look, I'm not saying I didn't swerve a little, he said, waving his hands, but if the fence hadn't been there, none of this would have happened. So, technically, she should pay for my repairs. That's just fair. The absurdity of the argument made me laugh, though there was no humor in it. This was classic HOA, Karen behavior: deny, deflect, and demand until people gave up. Her son had clearly inherited the tactic, but what he didn't seem to realize was that the officers weren't buying it. Their poker faces couldn't hide the faint smirks tugging at the corners of their mouths. One even exchanged a quick glance with a neighbor who had stepped closer, recording everything on his phone. And as if on cue, the queen herself arrived. Karen came marching down the sidewalk in a storm of indignation, her voice carrying across the block before she was even in sight. "What's going on here?" she shrieked, her heels clacking against the pavement. When she rounded the corner and saw the car embedded in my fence, her eyes widened, but not with concern for me. No, her fury zeroed in on the officers. This fence is the problem. It's been an eyesore for months. I told her it violated community guidelines, and now, look what's happened. You need to write her up, not my son. The neighborhood collectively held its breath. Karen's presence was like tossing gasoline onto an open flame. Her son puffed up with renewed confidence, nodding along with her words. I, meanwhile, stood tall, clutching the broken fence post in my hand like evidence of their absurdity. The officers turned back to their notes, their patience clearly thinning as the night's quiet tranquility dissolved into chaos. The crash had broken more than my fence. It had cracked open every simmering tension in the neighborhood, and what came next would leave everyone talking for weeks. The tension in the air was so thick, it could have been sliced with one of the splintered boards from my ruined fence. Karen stood at the curb with her arms crossed like a general ready to lead her troops into battle, her son behind her nodding eagerly at every word as though she were delivering divine truth. Neighbors gathered in a semicircle, their hushed voices mixing with the chirp of crickets and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The officers, to their credit, remained composed, though I could see the flicker of exasperation in their eyes as Karen launched into her tirade. "This fence has been a violation since the day it went up," she declared, her voice shrill enough to make even the bravest souls wince. "I've warned her in writing, I've warned her in meetings, and now, look, my son could have been killed because of her negligence. If you're going to cite anyone tonight, it had better be her. Frankly, you should be demanding she pay for my son's damages and for his emotional distress." Her words echoed across the street, and though a few neighbors tried to suppress chuckles, others shook their heads in disbelief. One of them, an older man named Mr. Crawford who lived 2 doors down, muttered just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Emotional distress? The only thing distressed here is that poor fence." His wife elbowed him, but she was grinning too. The lead officer, a tall man with a steady voice, finally raised a hand for silence. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "we've inspected the property line and the fence. It is not in violation of any city ordinance or traffic safety code. Your son lost control of his vehicle and collided with it. That makes him not the homeowner responsible." Karen's mouth fell open as though she had been personally insulted by the very concept of reality. Her son piped up quickly, trying to salvage the argument. "But you don't understand, officer. The way the road curves, it's like a trap. Anyone could have hit it. It's basically entrapment. He looked around, searching for validation from the crowd, but all he received were raised eyebrows and muffled laughter. The second officer, who had been quietly inspecting the car, now straightened up and called over. "Sir, can I see your license, registration, and proof of insurance?" The shift in tone was immediate. Karen's son froze, his confident bluster faltering. He patted his pockets, glanced back at his mother, and then reluctantly shuffled to the car. After some fumbling in the glove compartment, he produced a crumpled license and an expired registration slip. The officer's brow furrowed. "This registration expired 6 months ago. Do you have current documentation?" I I must have left it at home," he stammered, his voice wobbling. Karen swooped in like a hawk, snatching the papers from his hand and shoving them at the officer. "This is a misunderstanding," she snapped. "We're in the process of renewing. It's just a delay with the DMV. You know how it is." But the officer remained unmoved. "Even so, ma'am, the vehicle is not legally registered to be on the road, and without valid proof of insurance, we can't allow it to remain in operation." He stepped back, speaking into his radio with calm authority. "Dispatch, we're going to need a tow truck at this location." The words hung in the night like a thunderclap. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gathered crowd. Phones came up to record. Karen's son went pale, his hands trembling at his sides. "Wait, what? You can't tow my car. This is ridiculous." Karen erupted like a volcano. "Tow his car? Absolutely not. Do you have any idea who I am? I am the president of this community's homeowners association. I will not be treated like some common, ma'am." The lead officer interrupted, his patience thinning. "Your position on the HOA has no bearing on state law. Your son's car is unregistered, uninsured, and involved in a collision. It will be towed. That is not negotiable." The tow truck arrived with almost cinematic timing, its yellow beacon lights swirling across the houses. The rumble of its engine added weight to the moment, drowning out Karen's protests as the operator jumped down and got to work. The sound of metal chains clinking and ratcheting against steel was strangely satisfying. Neighbors leaned in closer, some with smirks plastered on their faces, others outright laughing now that the tide had turned. One woman whispered gleefully to her husband, "Can you believe this? All those times Karen fined me for leaving my garbage bins out an hour late, and now look at her, watching her son's car get hauled away." Her husband grinned. "Karma's faster than the garbage truck, apparently." Karen, meanwhile, was spiraling. She shouted at the officers, at the tow truck driver, at me, at anyone within earshot. Her voice cracked as she demanded special treatment, threatened lawsuits, and invoked rules from HOA bylaws as though they carried the weight of state law. The officers, unfazed, simply documented everything and let her rage burn itself out. Her son stood nearby, staring at the ground, his earlier bravado replaced with embarrassment so palpable it was almost painful to watch. When the sedan was finally lifted onto the flatbed, the crowd broke into a smattering of applause. It wasn't loud, not outright mocking, but it was enough to make Karen's face flush crimson in the glow of the tow truck's lights. She shot daggers at her neighbors, her glare promising future retribution, but it was clear the damage was already done. Her authority, once wielded like a weapon over the community, had cracked just as surely as the boards of my fence. The officers handed me a copy of the police report, neatly noting that I bore no fault in the incident. "You'll want to keep this for your insurance, though from what we can see, the vehicle's owner will be responsible for the damages," the lead officer explained. He gave me a small nod, the kind professionals reserve for someone who's just endured an absurd situation with grace. "We'll file the full report tomorrow. In the meantime, ma'am, have a good evening." A good evening. I nearly laughed at the absurdity of the phrase, but in a strange way, it was a good evening. My fence was in pieces. Yes, but the vindication was sweeter than I could have imagined. For once, the scales had tipped against Karen and her endless reign of petty tyranny. She stormed off with her son in tow, still muttering threats and promises of revenge. But the sight of that black sedan disappearing into the night on the back of a tow truck was burned into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. As the crowd dispersed, neighbors lingered to clap me on the back and murmur words of support. About time she got a taste of her own medicine, one said. Another added, "Don't worry about the fence. I'll help you fix it this weekend." Their smiles were genuine, their laughter infectious. For the first time in years, I felt the neighborhood united, not against me as Karen often tried to orchestrate, but against her. Later, when the street had grown quiet again, and I stood alone surveying the wreckage of my fence, I felt a strange peace. The boards could be replaced, the paint could be reapplied. What mattered most was the shift that had taken place in the hearts of my neighbors. Karen's power had always rested on fear and intimidation. But tonight, that illusion had crumbled. All it took was a crash, a lie, and the sharp clang of a tow chain to reveal the truth. And so, while my fence would take some work to mend, I went to bed that night smiling. Because fences can be rebuilt, cars can be repaired, but reputations, especially Karen's, don't get towed back so easily.